Thank you, Rufus, and thank you all for coming over this morning. And welcome to the Bay Area Council and the Klamath. And hope you have a enjoyable time here. And for those of you, how many of you have not been on the Klamath before? Is this the first time? Good. So well, it's an experience, I can tell you that. But take a tour around. You know, it's open to the public. There's a beautiful roof deck on top while you're here. You know, check it out. The views are unbelievable. Emily, thank you for coming over, and thanks for the great work you do at the Chronicle. And I've been reading your stuff and very, very impressed. So I reached out to Emily and said, would you be willing to come over and kind of talk about some of these issues, which are front and center issues, I think, for all of us. And we're obviously in a very challenged, interesting period. We're in a very political time. A lot has happened. A lot's happened since I asked you to come over. So it's probably changed a little bit, but we're going to try to talk about the state of California. We're going to try to talk about San Francisco. We might touch on other stuff, and it's really to hear from you. And I hope we'll have enough time to gain a few questions from the audience. So first, the last question I was going to ask you was about San Francisco and what you love about San Francisco. So instead of waiting for that, because we might not get to it, you've been here for 1.5 years, you told me, and you've been a number of other places. Ruby said, how do you feel about San Francisco? What do you love about it and enjoy about being here?
Yeah, well, thank you all for having me. Thank you all for coming here. So I've actually only been in San Francisco since February, but I've been at the Chronicle for 1.5 years, and it's been interesting, writing for an SF paper, but only actually moving here in February. And I feel like what I really love about the city, and I actually wrote about this at one point, was just the whole way that it's structured. I feel like it just flows. You walk down a street, you look up, there's a church. You walk down, there's a park, there's a library. There's these beautiful silhouettes and buildings. And I think that just the natural beauty of SF, I mean, obviously look where we are right now, and the energy that flows in that. And I think even though right now it is in a bit of a diminished state, it's still a lot better than where I was, which was Sacramento. And I just think that the way that it's set up, there's just something about it that facilitates exchanges and people interacting with each other on public transit, on the streets. There's a flow, there's an energy. And I know that's kind of hard to pin down, but I think especially after the years of COVID, I really feel that. And that's really what makes me happy to be here.
Well, you've chosen well. It's an incredible place. It has its, it has its needs and challenges, but we're all about trying to address those things. So let's, you talked about diminished states. So let's talk about California for a moment. Not many people got that. That's okay. Listen carefully. So there's, we're looking now at what's on the state ballot and what are the big issues that are kind of coming. And, today's a big day in Sacramento because it's the day the appropriations committees meet, and they either send forward or kill like a whole lot of bills. So those of us who are in the bill creation business or bill killing business are very interested in what Bob, usually bill killing, is the oil and gas industry. What do you wrote about the legislature's machinations on retail theft, and should it be a ballot measure, which is now Prop 36, or should there be legislation? It seems like there's kind of ending up being both. But how do you see how does that interaction between the governor, the legislature, the community sort of what does that say to you? You have a lot of experience writing about Sacramento. What does that say about where we're at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the whole retail theft, criminal justice fiasco really kind of underscores a lot of the political goings on in Sacramento. I mean, it was so fascinating, right? We've known for a long time that Californians are super fed up with retail theft, smash and grabs, open air drug use, things of that nature, just everyday quality of life issues. So I think lawmakers, after a couple of years of pushing very aggressive criminal justice reforms, sort of realized, oh crap, like some of the stuff may not be working as intended. Voters seem pretty mad about it. We should probably do something about it. So they came up with this package of bills to crack down on retail theft, but without touching, at least in their telling of it, Prop 47, the 2014 initiative that penalties for some theft and drug crimes. They had this package of bills. And then, there were these district attorneys, retailers, other groups pushing forward this ballot measure that became Prop 36 that would reform Prop 47, but not as aggressively as, pre-Prop 47. Like, it would crack down on crime, but I think it still understands, we're not going to just throw people in prison, lock the key, throw it away, run away. But, lawmakers, they were trying to negotiate this off the ballot. They wanted to keep Prop 47 intact. So they say, oh, we're going to amend our own bills that we've been working on for more than a year to negate them, to kill them, if voters actually approve this ballot measure. And, a lot of people saw that as a bit of a bait and switch. And it's like, well, did you actually want to address the issue, or were you just using this as a bargaining chip? And they kept repeatedly saying, these bills legally conflict with the ballot measure. And so I'm reading the ballot measure, I'm reading the bills, and I don't see legal conflicts. There's overlaps. There's things that you could pile on top of each other. If you had both the bill and the ballot measure, conceivably, you could maybe address something a bit more harshly than you could with just one or the other. But there was nothing that would, negate itself, like cancel each other out. So it was very clearly a political ploy. So then finally they took out those amendments because we kind of called them out on it. Other people called them out on it. The community was outraged. The governor had a last minute attempt to put his own measure on the ballot to reform Prop 47, despite saying for years that he doesn't want to reform Prop 47. But then, he drops it at the last minute because he has to go run and be a surrogate for President Joe Biden. I think we all know how that ended. The thing that is just so funny to me, we're speaking about the suspense file, we're speaking about the bills, is that, lawmakers repeatedly said these bills legally conflict with the ballot measure, but they've passed the bills without those amendments to self-destruct. The governor is probably going to sign them next week. And so we're going to end up with the very situation that they said for months was legally impossible, which is that you're going to have the bills, and if voters approve the ballot measure, you're also going to have the ballot measure. So they were kind of selling a false bill of goods, to be completely honest with you. They were misleading the public about the legal conflicts. And I think that it's because they didn't want to lose that political battle, right? I think Prop 47 has sort of become one of these third rails of politics. It's a bit of a golden goose. It's a legacy of the Brown administration. And the idea that, 10 years later, they're going to have to reverse themselves, I think it's a bit of a gut check for them. And I don't know if they really appreciated that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see the way things kind of turn out. And now we'll see what happens with the proposition and these measures, and see what the governor does about it, and how Californians feel about it. Obviously a big issue. On big issues, PPIC just did another poll of California voters and found, probably no surprise, that homelessness rises to the top as a top issue for Californians. And no matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, no matter what part of the state you live in, you think this is a really big issue that is kind of plaguing your community, and you want something done about it. And so, the governor's been, I think, out on this and pretty aggressive about it. And, since I think even we spoke, came out in favor of, after the decision on the Grants Pass case, came out and said, okay, cities, it's time for you to step up and remove your encampments. And if you don't remove your encampments, you're going to be at risk of losing funding, and all the money that we're putting forward, you won't get your share of that, and so forth. Talk about this issue a little bit, because I think it's a really, it's a character issue for California, which has a lot of characters in it. What do you, the relationship between cities and the governor? He mentioned he was out for Biden, and then now he's not. And so he's doing this. And how does this all kind of fit together? And what do you see in the future? Do you think this is something that we can actually tackle as a state? And we haven't seen a whole lot of visible progress. And obviously the voters don't think there's been much progress, a lot of money being spent.
Yes, quite a bit of money. I believe it's in the more than 20 billion now. And I'm sure you're all aware there was a recent state audit that found the state essentially has no idea how that money is being spent, if it's effective, or what their data-driven results of that are. So, and I think we all can kind of observe that anecdotally, just walking around. I think it's been interesting to watch the governor interact with local government leaders on this issue. He, has basically taken more and more steps to pin the blame to a certain extent for the lack of progress on counties and on cities. That's part of what Care Court was, saying, hey, these counties, you're under an obligation to help these people who are severely mentally ill. You need to treat them, you need to give them housing, and if you don't do it, we're gonna basically charge you for not holding up your end of the bargain. And he recently went down to Los Angeles County, which I think was actually a bit funny because there were a lot of people campaigning for Vice President Kamala Harris. The LA leaders were in Paris for the Olympics, and the governor was just cleaning up a homeless encampment in LA. And I think, yeah, it was a bit interesting juxtaposition to observe that. But he was mad at LA because they were saying, well, the governor telling us to be more aggressive on homelessness after the Supreme Court ruling, that's criminalizing homelessness. There's nowhere for these people to go, so we're not going to really follow what he's saying. And I think he was kind of going down there and saying, look, this is what you need to be doing, and there's no excuse anymore. The responsibility of the counties, the cities, and the state, the issue is that clearly I think cities and counties can and should be doing more. The problem is that the state has really never had, and to this day still does not have, a comprehensive vision for addressing homelessness. It has no blueprint. It has no, it doesn't even have guidelines of what it's trying to achieve. Like, are you trying to achieve a 10% reduction in 2 years? Are you trying to represent, and the governor last year, he was threatening to withhold funding because the local governments had submitted homelessness plans that would collectively reduce homelessness, I think 2% by 2024, something like that. And he said, well, that's not acceptable. But the flip side of that question is, well, what is acceptable? And I feel like the state has not really given out those guidelines for folks to meet. And that has given him an excuse to say, well, you're not doing your part. But what are those parts? And I think that that's something that state auditors and investigators have repeatedly said, is that the state is not outlining what it needs to do. It's true that the state has approved and given far more funding than it really ever has. But again, money without a plan is not going to solve the problem.
Plans seem a little diffuse, even if there are some Prop 1 and so forth. There's a number of things he's done that he's led on, which were controversial. At least they started out being
conservatorship reform.
Yeah, those kinds of things. And we have a bill that's up today. We'll see if it makes it through, that would really support interim housing, which we think is a really key area here, which really hasn't been part of anybody's policy. So we'll see if that makes it through. It's a tough one, but that's up today. Let me ask you about this. Both of these issues. We're in a state that historically was fairly split between Republicans and Democrats. For many years, we had Republican governors, Republican constitutional officers, a fleeting glimpse of Republican majority in the legislature, but close. And we also didn't have the 50% budget, 50% plus one budget. So it took 2/3. So the minority party, which was the Republicans in modern times, was very influential. But that's gone away. And we now not only have a super majority, but I call it's a super duper majority, right? But the boat bangs around like that. So it's probably not an earthquake. It's okay. If we think it's not, we'll tell you to leave, but you're fine. So we're going to fix it, but it's hard to fix. So boats are expensive. Yeah, for everything else. So with this dominance by one party in Sacramento, how's that working? You'd think, well, we've got the super duper majority, so we should be able to get everything done, and everything should be okay by now. How do you see it?
Yeah. Well, clearly that's not happening, and I will say that just from my own personal observation, I think it's never ideal to have one party, whatever party it is, dominate to that extent the legislature, the state offices. I used to work in Utah, where I believe they also, at least at the time, had a supermajority of Republican state legislators. And I just think that whenever you have that, the other side, there's no room for dissent. There's no room for conversation, for debate. It's about kind of towing the party line. I think it tends to gravitate towards the extremes of either party. And it's really interesting because just this past week, we saw one of the very moderate Democrats in the legislature switch parties to becoming a Republican. And we very quickly saw this sort of backlash where the Democratic leaders strip her of all of her committees. We're not sure what's going to happen with her bills. And, I guess all's fair in politics, but at the same time, it's sort of like you can't, there's not room for that conversation and that understanding. And I think as well, especially when it comes to issues like the budget, in the past, when you had to have that 2/3 supermajority vote to approve the budget, you had to bring the leaders of the Republican and the Democratic Senate and Assembly together with the governor to have those conversations, hash out those deals. There was that debate because it wasn't clear what was going to happen, and you would have to compromise more. And sometimes compromises, I guess, can lead to unfortunate outcomes, or it can lead to sort of a quid pro quo situation. But the reality is that that's still happening within the Democratic Party, and all of this debate is happening behind closed doors. And I just think that it leads to, folks maybe feeling disenfranchised, where again, there's not that opportunity to offer another point of view within the party. And it's been really interesting to see that even with Prop 36, because you're having the Democratic Party and a lot of the top Democratic leaders say, no, we don't support Prop 36. But then there's been this like breakaway group of Democratic legislators and even mayors coming out in support of it, but they're definitely a bit of a minority. And I think could there be political backlash for that? So yeah, in general, I just think it's always better to have a mix of viewpoints and mix of perspectives. I think from an ideological perspective, it's better to skew towards the middle than it is to skew to either the right or the left too far, because I think most Californians and most people in general view themselves as a pretty middle of the road person. We're seeing, the independents in California do skew Democratic, but again, what type of Democrat? Yeah.
Is, yesterday, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, ABAG, pulled off, I guess it's BAFA, but it's the same board, yes, pulled off the housing bond measure that they've been working on for a long time, because 55% probably seemed impossible, and the state requirement is 67%, and changing that may seem impossible. So it seems like maybe are the elected officials out of touch with where the voters are at this point in an unusual way? It kind of seems to me like maybe there's a bigger gap.
Yeah, well, I think the issue of money and bonds is really, really interesting. And we saw this in the March primary when the governor had his ballot measure Proposition 1 that asked for $10 billion in bonds to I think it was 10, right? To create, or was it, yeah, six, yeah, I think it might have been 6 now that I'm remembering. Yeah, thank you. I was like fact checking myself there. $6 billion in bonds for supportive housing and behavioral health facilities. And that measure barely squeaked by. It was like 51%, right? And I think that we are seeing, again, with these reports, like the state spent more than $20 billion on homelessness and no one can account for where this money went. We're seeing reports in San Francisco of, the city paid X and Y nonprofit to do this work for the city. And it turns out that money was being spent for the nonprofit leaders, or for these little parties, or for fancy food and drinks, right? And I think that there's this overwhelming sense of, okay, yes, clearly we need money to do things that need to be addressed in our state, in our city. But if we just keep approving these bonds, if we just keep throwing money at the problem, are we actually solving it? Are our elected officials trustworthy? Are they reliable stewards of this money? And we were talking earlier about BART and how, we cannot let BART and our public transit systems collapse, but nor can we just keep approving money for the sake of having a system exist that is not using that money well. And so there really need to be, I think there does need to be a wake-up call for elected officials that you can't just keep going back to the voters and asking them for money, especially when we're seeing at the state level a mismanagement of money, and not projecting well into the future. We have deficits. Lawmakers and the governor knew there were going to be deficits, yet they continued to approve spending that they acknowledged that they couldn't afford. And that's not acceptable. we wouldn't allow that for our own household, you know? And so it's unfair to just keep going back to voters and saying, oh, we spent your money wrong or we didn't plan it well. Can we have more? People are going to be mad about that.
You know, if you decide to leave journalism, you might want to work for the Bay Area Council. You sound more like us than us. So you mentioned San Francisco, so let's turn our attention to San Francisco. So I led off with what you love about San Francisco. What frustrates you, and now that you've lived here most of a year or half a year, and you work for the Chronicle, which is a big voice in San Francisco, very big. What do you see? The doom loop, the things we actually see out on the streets, the attempts to address it, the mayor's race. What's your feelings about San Francisco at this point? Are we making progress in the city on these issues? Are we just throwing out ideas? Are we on a path there's a lot of folks who are saying it's getting better, come back, and so forth. There's some indication of slow regrowth in the economy. On the other hand, it's really slow. And from the outside perspective, looking in, if you go visit another place in the country or the world and you say you're from San Francisco, you don't get that loving look like we used to get. People look like, ooh, is that really happening? What do you see going on here?
Yeah, I feel like it's sort of all of the above. I think that, again, clearly you walk around certain parts of the city and you're like, well, that's not looking too good, or things don't seem to be going too well. I do sense this, though, that there is a growing sense of optimism. There are trends that are in the right direction. We have more positive trends on crime. I think there's a sense that, the police, the DA, they are trying to be more aggressive in how crimes are prosecuted. The mayor has said, arrest drug dealers and drug users, which is quite rare, I think, among Democratic cities in California. So there is a sense of like, enough is enough and we need to get control of this. It's the summer, there's more tourists. At least I see. I live not far from Union Square, and I see people lining up for the cable cars. There's music, there's events happening. I think there is that sense of buoyancy. It's always easier to be happier in the summer, I feel like, as well. But at the same time, I think that, I don't know, there are other trends that are concerning to me. And I would say one of them is sort of the decline of families in San Francisco and of children. And I think that that's quite concerning because obviously that's the next generation, right? And we're having a conversation here in SF about closing schools, which is going to need to happen partially because of poor financial management, again, in deficit spending for years after years after years. And I think one of the things that has frustrated me about San Francisco is the continued gap between the rhetoric and the reality. We hear people talking about, again, going back to the schools, like we have to think about equity, but then you look at the educational outcomes in SFUSD, and it's among the greatest educational achievement gaps in the entire state. That makes absolutely no sense in one of the wealthiest regions of the state. And for a district that continues to say, well, equity is our North Star. Well, it can't be if these are the results that you're getting. And so I think, again, there are a lot of great ideas in the city. There are a lot of very inspirational ideals and I think values that we hold that many of us support. The harder thing has been, how do you actually translate that ideal into policy, into a practical policy, a pragmatic policy, a realistic policy? Because I think right now people are feeling fed up with, well, you keep saying all these things that sound really nice and we all support in the abstract, but that's not translating down to our daily life and our daily experience. And I go back again to even things like, you just go into a store, you go into Walgreens, you go into CVS, you have to ring a bell to get anything out of the shelf. I don't think that's normal. Like, I just don't think that that's the society that we should be living in. And that's not the society that we were living in 10 years ago even. And so I think that we really do have to question, yes, we don't want to over criminalize, we don't, and we don't want to be harsh or overly punitive, but we also need to create like a functional society.
Well, like I said, if you decide to leave journalism, So,
don't know if I answered the question.
so, so you use the word pragmatic. Another word for pragmatic might be moderate. So the defining chasm in San Francisco politics is this progressive versus moderate, whether you sort of believe in that or not. So yeah, recently the voters, at the urging of certain groups that got heavily involved, recalled the district attorney. They recalled 3 members of the San Francisco Unified School District board, although there's some hint that maybe they're heading back in the direction they came from. We saw some changeover at the Board of Supervisors. There's 6 seats up and a mayor's race. So, and there's a lot of discussion about this, and it seems like there's a move toward pragmatism or fed upness or something. What do you think is happening in Democratic Central Committee vote? What do you think is happening in San Francisco? And you think it, is it something likely to be sustained, or is it, an ebb and flow?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and one that I've been thinking about a lot. I do feel like, in general, politics is an ebb and a flow, right? I mean, we enact a policy in a certain time, and then we're like, oh, that doesn't seem to be working too well. So we go back to what we did before. That didn't work too well either. So I think in SF, there's clearly a move towards the center, whatever that means in SF politics. It's different than the rest of California and the rest of the country. There's a sense that the progressive governance of, however, the past few years has not led to the desirable outcomes, and so people are wanting to shift more towards results-oriented leadership, data-driven leadership. I think the challenge is going to be for those groups, for those candidates, to practice what they preach. Again, and this is kind of what I'm doing too, it's a lot easier to sit there and be like, well, that's not working. But then once you're in there, how are you going to make it work, right? That's the challenge for all the Board of Supervisor candidates, the school board candidates, the mayor candidates. I mean, once you're actually in the infrastructure, in the bureaucracy, how do you make it function the way that you say that it should? And it's been very interesting for me to observe because, I'm kind of new to SF politics, and I am seeing how vicious and crazy it is, I think, compared to the politics in other places, even in Sacramento. And seeing some of these moderate groups ascend sort of the ranks of influence, gain power, spend more and more money, they have not been immune from their own issues, whether it be, sexual assault allegations that are resurfacing, concerns that money is being spent improperly. There's too close ties between candidates and some of these groups. They're going to have to get past all of that. You're going to have to distance yourself from the very things that you said have problematic about the other faction of the Democratic Party to actually focus on the policy. Again, I think the tendency in SF, and this kind of goes back to the rhetoric and the reality thing, we keep getting caught up in the politics. But what about the policies, right? And how do you get the politics to get the policy that you want to enact? And so I think even if we do elect, if voters in SF do elect a wave of moderate candidates to office this year, will the conditions materially change for San Franciscans? I think that remains to be seen. And I think that it's quite probable that if they don't, you'll see a return back to the more progressive side of the spectrum because, once the incumbents are there, they're going to be judged on their record.
Well, from a business community perspective, there's some level of desperation, I would tell you, especially for people who own commercial property, whether they be hotels or office buildings. Like I've served in 2 administrations and I've seen tough times, but we've never really seen anything quite as extreme as this, where so many folks are handing keys back to banks and it just seems, and San Francisco's recovery has trailed the state, which trails the nation. I mean, there's some obvious problems here, and a lot of people in the business community attribute this to the politics. And then there's a lot of people in the community who attribute all the problems of San Francisco to the business community, billionaires, selfish people, people who aren't civically engaged, whatever the arguments may be. So there's been a historic dichotomy there. How do you see the relationship between City Hall and the business community today shaping up? Is there an opportunity here for things to get to a point where business sees San Francisco differently, or is the main strategic question in the boardroom of a San Francisco company, how do we get the heck out of here?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I do get the sense that, and I mean, Jim, you probably know more about this than I do, but I do get the sense that there is a slight shift. I mean, even considering some of the measures that are going to be on the local ballot in November, the business taxes and things like that, there's a sense that we do need to lure businesses back. Maybe we were a bit too aggressive in taxing them and regulating them in the past, making it difficult to, open here, things like that. I feel like there's also, at least to the casual observer, there's a bit of a dichotomy between like the smaller businesses and the bigger businesses. I feel like to a certain extent, it's always inevitable to cast big business, right, as a bit of a boogeyman. But and I actually wrote about this one time because it's like we say things like big business, big tech, big water, big agriculture, prison industrial complex. But like, what is that? I don't really know what that means. And I feel like maybe there are specific bad actors within those larger categories, but just kind of categorically saying, oh, big business is bad. I don't think that's really a helpful metric for evaluating, a business's contribution to their community, and how they should be regulated, if that makes sense. And at the same time, I think there's also a concern that part of the way that San Francisco kind of got into this doom loop, if you will, in the first place was that it relied too heavily on a certain type of business and made it so easy for them to come here, so attractive for them to come here, that we became so dependent on them that now we no longer have a diversified economic blueprint in the city. And so how do we kind of create a more diverse set of businesses, encourage mom and pops and the big businesses, and then also each group needs to pay their fair share in determining what that is.
I mean, we used to have a pretty diverse economy in San Francisco, actually, except there was no tech back in those days, right? So we had oil and gas industry, we had utilities, we had banks, we were the financial capital of the West, and almost all of that, if not all of it, it's pretty much gone. And so that got replaced with technology, which is the business that thrives, everywhere. So that, and kind of everything is technology. So it's hard to have a really successful economy and ignore the technology, because that's where all the money is, and that's where that's where the action is. But I agree. What is it going to take for us to bring back a diverse economy? Is there, you see hope in a strategy that attracts some of those kinds of businesses back to San Francisco, or some kind of, let's just say, non-tech focused business?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think there is a very clear hunger for those types of experiences. I mean, again, I live not far from Union Square. You walk down Powell, all of those storefronts are empty, right? And that's pretty discouraging to see. And it's insane that you're in the middle of a world-class city and there's just nothing there. There's people that could walk into stores, have experiences, and they're not. And I remember maybe a couple of months ago, there was this like tulip festival or tulip day in SF where they were just handing out free tulips, which, I mean, you can buy them for like $5, but there was like thousands of people lined up for hours to get these tulips, right? So I'm like, the people are here, the demand is here, people want to be here, but we have not found an effective way to harness that energy. And I think that especially post-pandemic, it's not just about, oh, you walk into a store and you like rifle through the aisles and you buy something. It's about creating these sorts of community experiences where it's not even about what the activity is, it's the act of being together with other people in that activity. I don't know what the strategy is for that. I just think that that's my sense of what people want, especially younger people that started their lives really during the pandemic. I keep seeing all these weird flyers on poles everywhere where it's like speed dating random people, and I'm like, what the heck? And I feel like the people just don't know how to meet people anymore, you know what I mean? And there needs to be some sort of entrepreneur who figures out how to make that happen. That's not me, but
if you go back to the birth of the Bay Area Council at the end of World War II, this was an incredibly industrialized region. I mean, that, and very successful economically. And it started to change from that. I mean, this boat was built at the Bethlehem shipyard in 1924 in San Francisco, and we're not building any boats today. We buy boats as my running the ferry system. we buy boats, they get made in the state of Washington because we don't build boats. So I've been hammering my own board and anyone who's willing to listen, since we're going to be building zero emission ferries, why don't we try building them in the bay? And that brings up the bigger question of sort of a re-industrialization. As we're not going to do that at large, but at least take what could be our potential industrial capacity. And when I say that to people, they look at me like you're kind of looking like a little oddly, like, what do you mean? How could we have industry here in the Bay? Because even the laws about how we operate on the Bay make it pretty much, what I've been told is it's pretty much impossible for a shipyard to operate and build ships on San Francisco Bay. And it's the maritime industry, and it's a bay, and it's got a history. I mean, is there something we could do to kind of change the mindset of people, or is that a bad idea?
No, I don't think I don't think it's a bad idea. And I was kind of thinking about this too. We were talking about oil and gas and things like that. And I feel like there's been a movement in Sacramento, maybe California more generally, where you do just kind of knee-jerk blame industry for various things. And I've been doing a lot of reporting on the insurance industry, which I know is everyone's favorite topic, very sexy topic. But, there were a lot of Democratic legislators that when homeowners insurance companies started pulling out of the state, they were like, well, they're price gouging, they're colluding, things like that. Not saying we shouldn't look into that, but to not think about other factors that might be contributing to those things happening, maybe policies that you yourself have, put forward that could be contributing to that. It's very important to take a holistic view and not just reflexively look for something to blame that's a convenient target. It was interesting too, because I was thinking about Richmond. I think they had a proposed ballot measure that would have taxed, I believe, Chevron $1 per barrel produced there. There are people that were concerned. On the one hand, yes, there's environmental impacts, of course. On the other hand, there are people saying, well, that employs a lot of people in our community. And what are you going to do if you drive that company out of the town? How do we find that middle ground? And they actually took it off the ballot. They approved a settlement with Chevron. But to your larger point, industrialization, thinking about these companies, there are all these different groups at the table. And I feel like we just need to find a way to find a middle ground that makes sense and not be so all or nothing, black or white with everything that we do. Same with the zero emission transition. I mean, thinking about, okay, well, we're going to move towards that future, but how do we ensure that the people that, can't afford an electric car or whatever it may be, how are they going to continue to afford to live in the state? How are businesses going to be able to continue to live in the state? What if you can't turn your ferry into a zero emissions ferry like right away? So how are you going to make that happen? Again, the ideal versus the pathway.
And if we are going to have a green economy, can we have a green economy?
What
are the things we need to do to actually make that happen? So, being a leader means, actually leading. And we see the green economy growing in other states.
Yes.
And look at where the federal money has come in, mounds of money. And it's not coming to California because we've regulated it to go elsewhere. We've made it so expensive and so difficult.
Well, no, and it's really interesting because I was thinking about the solar industry. There were all these subsidies, these things for people to put solar panels on their home. And then there were concerns that now that that's happened, people that don't have solar are subsidizing wealthier people that were able to put the solar on the home. So then they slashed the subsidies. But then now there's solar workers who are out of jobs and people are not putting solar on their homes anymore, but we also need the solar because of the energy goals. So it's very complex. But I think, yeah, we need to think about the cause and the effect of policies that are being put forth.
Transition is complicated, it's expensive, it's dicey, and yet the state wants to be a leader. And so all of the different things that it does, are causing, I think, a lot of challenges for the folks within the domain who are trying to get along, or historically invested here, live here, want to stay here, but they're finding it, what I hear from our folks is they're finding it more and more difficult rather than more incentivized to be here. You mentioned before and I want to open it up to questions in a couple of minutes, but you mentioned the corruption, and I'm not saying the administrations I worked in were like squeaky clean. I don't know. But I've never seen anything like this in San Francisco, at least in modern times, my time. which goes back a way. And, just one after the other, bureaucrat, elected official, nonprofit group. It just seems like, I don't think it's just because there's an investigation and they're catching people. I mean, I think that it seems to me there's been a change that enables this kind of behavior, or maybe encourages it, certainly allows for it. And yet, I don't see the media really covering it the way I would kind of expect. I would think it would be, for example, a front and center issue in the mayor's race. And, mayoral candidates would be saying, if you elect me, I'll stamp out the corruption. But maybe nobody but me cares. Maybe you, but you mentioned it. But a lot of folks don't seem to talk about this much. They go, okay, as a Bureau of Building Inspection, or, it's this department or that. Oh yeah, that nonprofit. Yeah, they're terrible. But not really calling for something to change as a mainstay issue. Is it, or is it just not that important?
Well, I do feel like some of the candidates are talking about that. I mean, Daniel Lurie, he has repeated, because he leads a nonprofit, he's repeatedly said, well, there's more than 100 nonprofits doing business in SF, and probably all of them are doing the right thing. I think all of them have talked about that to certain extents. I mean, slashing commissions, trying to reduce the bureaucracy. The mayor has tried to streamline various permitting processes. But yeah, I mean, I think corruption is a hard one, and I think because it does require dismantling structures that politicians have themselves built, right, and benefited from in a lot of ways. And I do want to note quickly that this is not just an SF problem. I mean, obviously we're in SF, but I'm thinking about all the stuff that's coming out in Oakland with the FBI raids, which we don't really know what they're about, but doesn't look too good. In LA, I think it's like 4 of 7 council members previously have been put in prison. So there's
for who's the most corrupt.
Yeah, so there's definitely sketchy things going on everywhere. I do think it is an issue in the mayor's race. But something that I've been thinking about, because I was covering these various efforts to cut down on the number of commissions in San Francisco and all of these boards that have kind of sprung up and, take taxpayer money, time, officials, things like that. Once something is put there, it's extremely difficult to get rid of it, right? Because there's people that have a vested interest in what that is. And there's also the optics of it, where it's like, oh, but we have this group that's overseeing this other group, or we have this local community nonprofit that's helping us address this issue. And that doesn't sound good to say, like, we're going to get rid of that, or we're going to investigate these people. And then there's also the question of, well, who are the investigators? Is there corruption in that? And so it's a very complex issue to deal with. And I think at the end of the day, whenever people are involved, there's going to be some bad things going on. That's just kind of human nature. And I will say as well that even in the mayor's race, some of the candidates themselves have their own questions of ethics concerns. I think most of them do to some extent or another. And some of them more financial, some of them more behavioral. But there's, it's kind of just a constant.
When you limit, it's been a $500 maximum contribution since I was, first came here. And so when you do that, folks are going to find another way, and they sure have been able to find other ways. So I want to open it up. So if do you have questions? Go ahead. Let's have 1 and 2. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
I was hoping you could just comment on the state of journalism today in the sense of covering politics. I worked in the 90s as a press flack, and it was a whole Capitol Bureau up there of papers that had representatives, TV that had representatives covering the Capitol, covering the legislature, the governor, and that's very different today, and that's absent today. And so it kind of speaks to maybe your prior role, but just in the way journalism today covers politics at the local level as well as the state level.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for the question. There's no question that there's less folks covering these lawmakers, these state houses, these commissions, these boards. There's fewer journalists. People don't want to pay for journalism, which is also a big part of it. All the time I get questions like, well, I want to read your article, but I don't want to subscribe. It's like, well, that's only going to work for so long. But yeah, and I think that what the result of that is that we have politicians who are emboldened to skirt the rules, to push the boundaries. I mean, in Sacramento, some of the maneuvers that they were trying to do to get around the Prop 36 reform was so sketchy and so egregious, but it was as if they anticipated that no one would notice what they were doing. No one would care. They wouldn't be questioned by it. There's an increasing level in which politicians don't even care to talk to the media because they don't have to, right? They can put it on their TikTok, they can put it on their Twitter, they don't want to take the questions. I mean, Kamala Harris is not really spoken to the media. Our governor notoriously is not very friendly to the media. There are a lot of local officials that just don't view it as a risk worth taking. And when you have fewer people to call them out on that, it's just a vicious cycle that keeps perpetuating itself. And so I think it's really important to have journalists continue to show up. And I think one thing that I've been loving since, we don't have the pandemic restrictions is like actually showing up, going to the State House, going to these commission meetings, going to places that, you can find these folks and, put them on the spot and hold them to account. Because if they won't answer your phone calls, if they won't answer your emails, or they're only going to respond to you with an unnamed, AI response that may or may not be an actual employee, you got to show up to where they're at and be like, excuse me, you need to comment on this. Because again, these are taxpayer resources. They are accountable to us. And so for them to act like they're not it's not acceptable.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is outstanding. That's why I came here.
Thank you.
It's not that far because we have Caltrain now. It goes faster.
It wasn't the electric one. It still took me an hour.
Not yet, but soon. Soon.
But anyway, so on the question of transparency, we just had AB 2570, which was a transparency bill around the money given for so-called addressing housing or lack thereof. That was just vetoed by the governor. So I think that the government in general is not open to transparency. For example, for once, we have a great LA controller in Los Angeles who is doing an exceptional job, and then the Mayor Bass and the city attorney are not allowing him to actually audit the books, which is his job. So I think like you said earlier, it's not about which party you belong to. It's just when the whole thing is one party, basically. And I like to have safety, by the way, but I'm also I don't blame the most vulnerable in our community. The drug use safe sites have been closed, pushing people to jail for lack of housing when we have, as a government, created that problem is not the solution. Criminalizing the people is not the solution. And people are benching bills right and left. Like, for example, whether you like it or not, Medicare for All is very popular in California. But the assembly speaker benched it twice. Now the third time is gone to a committee. Nobody knows who is voting what way. Regardless, you have to have transparency, regardless of what side of the politics or bills you're on. Same thing with accountability.
I want to get a question from you. Is it a question on
So
how do
we get around all of this expenditure, which I support the cause, but not the way it's being done because too many cronies are making money out of it.
Yeah. Well, I think it helps to continue calling attention to the issue, keep saying they're not trying to show this information. They're trying to hide this information. I feel like it has been helpful in recent years, again, because it is a one-party state in the legislature. You're not going to really have effective opposition from within the legislature. And I sort of do feel like the press and the public are the last bulwarks against that, where you're showing up, you're making a stink about it, you keep kind of beating the dead horse. They're going to have to answer for themselves eventually. And I think even sometimes exposing the lengths to which they're going to not be transparent. Like you were mentioning the suspense file today in appropriations, where they've created this whole process where they don't even have to say how they voted on a bill. I mean, we should just keep telling that, right? I mean, even if they don't change their ways, ensuring that people understand that they have set up these processes with the express purpose of being opaque, I think that can galvanize people to act and get involved.
You mentioned AI as an example of what could happen in a discourse with a legislator.
That was a joke, by the way. I don't want to
yeah.
accuse anyone of doing that.
But, one of those bills up today is Senator Wiener's AI bill, which is getting a lot of attention in the tech community nationally, because they figure if it happens in California, it's going to become this national standard. And a lot of folks are worried about it here because we think we have a business advantage on AI that we might sacrifice if we overregulate it. So how do you see, the AI issue seems to be the big issue du jour when it comes to public policy, or one of the big issues. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, AI, oh gosh, it's such a complex issue. And I think it kind of comes back to what motivates humans to act, right? It can be the green economy, it can be AI. If there's this sense that our competitors are going to beat us to it, we have to get there first, right? Even if there are adverse consequences. I think, as with anything, there are pros and cons to AI. When it comes to regulating it, I think that there should be some level of regulation. I think we've sort of seen when it comes to social media, right? There were a ton of adverse consequences of the lack of government intervention in social media. Yes, there was innovation. There was also a pretty sizable, I think, societal cost to that. At the same time, you do not want to quash small businesses. And I think for me, it's like, you don't want to give the big businesses that have the capacity to, circumvent the laws or hire lobbyists or raise money or what that, you don't want them to have like the sole power over this new product. You want to encourage a lot of folks in the space. So I don't know what the answer is. I feel like I'm still developing my own perspective on AI. I think I'm partially trying to pretend that it's not there. So yeah.
I don't know the solution either, but I would offer one. Go ahead. We have 5 more minutes. I want to ask you about Kamala Harris before we go.
Big elephant in the room that nobody wants to address, that's killing California, and more companies are moving out, are the unions. The prison, the teachers, the SEIU, who's going to be paying their pensions? The other states are not going to bail out California. Are they starting these conversations that we're going to have to readjust the contracts, the pensions?
That's a great question. I don't know if they're starting those conversations. I think the liability is continuing to balloon, and that's of concern to a lot of folks. I believe this year CalPERS had like a pretty good return on its investment, so they're kind of touting that as we're getting closer to having more money to pay all the benefits. But no, I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a massive problem. And again, when you look at the fact that there's maybe fewer people that are going to be, young kids that are going to be able to help pay off all of this debt and liability, it's extremely concerning. And on the prisons, it's very interesting because, the Democratic legislature has continued to say, well, we're trying to shut down prisons. We have less of a prison population. Well, the prison guards are making more per prisoner than they ever have. They are getting massive raises. And it's a very big question where it's like, how are you gonna pay for that? And also, doesn't that run contrary to your stated values of increasing the prison budget, which has continued to grow actually in California? So it's a great question.
Thank you. And it's a question we ask all the time. And one of the questions would be, should elected officials be so close to the policy around what these benefits are? Because I think it's really hard for elected officials to turn their backs on organized labor, which is such a strong force in politics these days. So it's a very, very good question. So I did just want to ask about Kamala Harris. What's what's changed in San Francisco and California, particularly as a result of her candidacy for president, or has anything changed?
Yeah, I definitely do think things have changed. I think there was a very visible lack of energy and interest in Biden. I think a lot of folks, even Democrats, did not think he was up to another term. And I feel like once Kamala kind of ascended into that role, I know there were kind of questions about, well, this wasn't necessarily the most democratic process for this to happen. But it's like, wow, here's like a much younger person with a lot more vitality who can travel all the time, who can, kind of bring that energy back into things. I think we've actually seen Mayor Breed get some energy because of that, with her, her proximity to the vice president, and, just obviously two women of color kind of uplifting each other. So I think there has been this democratic re-energization. And even among a lot of young folks, I mean, there's been so many memes, there's been so many like GIFs and songs and remixes, which I don't know. I love that stuff because I was like, oh my God. But so I definitely think that there's stuff like that's happening. What's interesting to me about Harris too is, what does it mean for Newsom? And he was campaigning so aggressively for Biden. Kamala announced, and he was cleaning an encampment in LA. So we'll see if he hits the trail, for her as intensely as he would have for Biden. I think the wind has definitely been taken out of his sails a little bit as a surrogate, and it throws his future into question. But yeah, and I think it will bring more attention to California, her candidacy, and there will be more pressure on elected officials here to kind of get their act together on various quality of life issues, because that's going to be in ads, all across the country, encampments and drug use and fraud and waste and things like that.
Well, I know there's a lot more questions out, but I want to respect your time and everyone's time here. We've hit the noon hour, so I just want all of you to join me in thanking Emily for coming aboard. Thank you. And these next few months should be, these are interesting times, and we look forward to working with you, and maybe we'll repeat this after the election if you'd like. Come
great.
back, and we can do a little election review and see how things went and what that means for our future. So thanks, Emily. Appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. You did. Okay, yeah.
Can we get a photo?